The scalpel trembled in my left hand as I stood outside operating room 7, watching through the glass as my own sister lay unconscious on the table. 3 years of avoiding family gatherings, 3 years of proving myself in emergency rooms across the state, and now fate had delivered the ultimate test. The attending physician looked at my scarred hands, then at my face, and said the words that would either destroy me or define me. "Martinez, your lead surgeon on this one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." I stepped through those double doors, carrying more than surgical instruments. I carried the weight of every family dinner where they whispered about my condition, every Christmas where they treated me like broken glass, every phone call that started with, "How are you managing?" instead of, "How are you?" But most of all, I carried the memory of that rainy October night 4 years ago when everything changed. The accident happened on Interstate 25, just outside Denver. I was driving home from my final year of pre-med studies at the University of Colorado, rain beating against the windshield like bullets. The semi-truck ran the red light at 70 miles per hour. The impact folded my Honda Civic like origami, trapping me inside twisted metal and shattered dreams. For 6 hours, they cut me out piece by piece. When I finally opened my eyes in the ICU, my mother was crying and my father was staring at my hands like they belonged to someone else. The burns covered 40% of my body, second and third degree marks that painted abstract patterns across my arms, chest, and the left side of my face. But the real damage wasn't visible. It was in the way my family looked at me afterward, like I was a stranger wearing their daughter's name. During those first weeks of recovery, when the pain was so intense I couldn't think straight, I heard them talking in the hospital hallway. My mother's voice, sharp with desperation. "She'll never be the same, Robert. Medical school? Surgery. Look at her hands." My father's response cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. "We need to be realistic about her limitations now. Maybe something in administration, something safe where people won't have to look at her." They thought I was sedated. They thought I couldn't hear them planning my diminished future, discussing my life like I was already dead. But I heard every word, felt every syllable burn deeper than the fire that had marked my skin. That was the moment I decided that their pity would become my fuel, their doubt would sharpen my determination. The rehabilitation was brutal. Physical therapy sessions that left me screaming into pillows. Occupational therapy where I relearned how to hold a pen, a fork, a dream. The nerve damage in my right hand meant I had to retrain my entire dominant side. I spent months learning to write left-handed, to suture with fingers that only remembered pain. My medical school advisor, Dr. Patricia Huang, sat me down during my first week back to classes. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Elena, have you considered switching to pathology? Or perhaps radiology? Your test scores are excellent, but surgery requires a certain physical precision." Even my professors had written me off. The woman I'd idolized, whose lectures on trauma surgery had first inspired me to pursue medicine, was now suggesting I hide in a basement laboratory, looking at slides instead of saving lives. I nodded politely, thanked her for her concern, and then spent the next 18 months proving every single person wrong. I graduated summa cum laude. Not just graduated, I shattered every curve, demolished every expectation. My thesis on burn trauma treatment was published in 3 medical journals, but the real test came during residency matching day. I'd applied to trauma surgery programs across the country, knowing that my scars would be the first thing program directors noticed. The rejection letters started arriving in March. "Thank you for your interest, but we feel you might be better suited for internal medicine. While your academic credentials are impressive, we have concerns about your ability to handle the physical demands of surgical training." 27 programs. 27 rejections. Until Dr. James Morrison at St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix sent a different kind of letter. "Your personal statement moved me to tears. Your understanding of trauma from both sides of the operating table is exactly what our program needs. We'd like to offer you a position." My family's reaction was predictable. My mother cried, but not from joy. "Elena, sweetheart, Are you sure about this? Surgery is so demanding, so stressful. What if you have another accident? What if your hands can't handle the pressure? My sister Carmen was more direct. You're being selfish. You're putting patients at risk because you can't accept your limitations. Not everyone can be fixed, Elena. Sometimes you have to know when to quit. But I didn't quit. I showed up to St. Mary's that first day of residency, with my scars exposed, my head high, and my hands steady. The other residents stared, whispered, placed bets on how long I'd last. Some were cruel in that casual way that medical training encourages. Frankenstein's monster wants to play doctor, one muttered during our first trauma call. Another, watching me struggle with a particularly difficult suture during our skills lab, suggested I might want to consider less demanding specialties. The attending physicians were worse. They watched me like I was a liability waiting to happen, questioned every decision, double-checked every procedure. Dr. Sandra Yates, the trauma surgery chief, barely acknowledged my existence for the first 3 months. When she did speak to me, it was usually to redirect me toward observational learning rather than hands-on experience. I spent more time holding retractors than actually operating, more time taking notes than making incisions. The breaking point came during my 4th month. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of shift where everything that could go wrong did. A multi-car pileup had filled every trauma bay, and I was assigned to assist Dr. Yates on a complex abdominal surgery. A young father had been crushed by his steering wheel, internal bleeding that required immediate attention. As Dr. Yates worked, I anticipated every move, handed her instruments before she asked, maintained perfect visualization of the surgical field. For 40 minutes, we worked in perfect synchronization. Then my pager buzzed. Another trauma coming in, critical condition. Dr. Yates looked up, saw the blood on my gloves, the sweat on my forehead, and made a decision that would change everything. Martinez, I need you to close. I have to take the incoming trauma. She stripped off her gloves and headed for the door, then paused. Can you handle it? Everyone in that operating room went silent. The anesthesiologist, the surgical nurses, the medical students, all watching to see if the scarred resident would crumble under pressure. I looked down at the patient, this father who needed me to be perfect, who needed my damaged hands to save his life. I thought about every person who had told me I wasn't capable, every family member who had suggested I settle for less, every program director who had seen my scars before my skills. I've got this, I said. For the next hour and 20 minutes, I worked with a precision that surprised even me. Every suture was perfect, every tie was secure, every movement was deliberate and controlled. When I finally closed the last layer and stepped back, the room erupted in quiet applause. The head nurse, Maria Santos, who had been skeptical of me from day one, pulled down her mask and smiled. That was beautiful work, Dr. Martinez. But the real validation came 3 days later when Dr. Yates found me in the resident lounge. She sat down across from me, her expression unreadable. That surgery on Tuesday, she began. I've been reviewing the post-op reports, the healing progression, the patient outcomes. She paused, studying my face. I owe you an apology. I let my assumptions about your appearance cloud my judgment about your abilities. That was unprofessional and unfair. I waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. I've been practicing trauma surgery for 15 years, she continued. I've trained dozens of residents, seen every kind of surgeon walk through these doors. What you did in that operating room, the way you handled that complex closure under pressure, that wasn't just competent. That was exceptional. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. I've been thinking about why you're so good at this, why you see things other residents miss, why your hands are so steady under pressure. The words she said next would echo in my mind for years. Normal people can't do what you do, Martinez. Normal people haven't been where you've been, haven't fought the battles you've fought. Your scars aren't a limitation. They're your superpower. That conversation changed everything. Not just how Dr. Yates saw me, but how I saw myself. For the first time since the accident, I understood that my trauma hadn't made me broken. It had made me better. Word spread quickly through the hospital corridors. The resident with the scarred hands wasn't just competent. She was exceptional. Within weeks, other attendings were requesting me for their complex cases. Dr. Patricia Mills from cardiothoracic surgery pulled me aside after I'd assisted on a particularly challenging heart repair. "Your steady hands saved that patient's life," she said quietly. I've never seen a resident maintain such precise control during a 6-hour procedure, but success in the hospital didn't translate to acceptance at home. My parents still flinched when they saw me, still spoke in hushed tones about my situation when they thought I wasn't listening. The monthly family dinners became exercises in endurance, where my achievements were met with worried glances and uncomfortable silences. My cousin Miguel, fresh out of law school, would regale everyone with stories of his courtroom victories, while I sat at the far end of the table, my sleeves carefully pulled down to hide the worst of the scarring. During one particularly painful gathering, my Aunt Rosa cornered me in the kitchen. "Mija," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "your mother is so worried about you. This surgery thing, it's so stressful, so dangerous. Have you thought about teaching instead? You could inspire young people, help them from a safe distance." The implication was clear. Stay where people don't have to look at you, where your appearance won't make others uncomfortable. I excused myself early that night, driving back to my small apartment near the hospital with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The next morning, I threw myself even deeper into my work. If my family couldn't see my worth, then I'd prove it to everyone else. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Dr. Rebecca Chen, one of the most respected trauma surgeons in the Southwest, was visiting St. Mary's as part of a consulting rotation. She'd built her reputation working in war zones, treating injuries that would make most surgeons quit medicine entirely. When she arrived, she carried an aura of competence that made even the most arrogant attendings defer to her judgment. Her first day, she observed our trauma team during a particularly brutal shift. A construction accident had brought in 5 workers, each with devastating injuries that would test every skill we'd learned. I was assigned to assist Dr. Yates on the most critical case, a man whose chest had been crushed by falling steel beams. His rib cage was shattered, both lungs were punctured, and internal bleeding was making his condition deteriorate by the minute. As we worked, I noticed Dr. Chen watching from the observation deck above the operating room. Her eyes followed every movement, every decision, every technique we employed. At one point during the surgery, when we encountered unexpected bleeding from a damaged artery, I suggested a modified approach that would minimize tissue damage while providing better access. Dr. Yates hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Show me," she said. I guided her through the technique, explaining my reasoning as we worked. The bleeding stopped, the repair held, and the patient's vitals stabilized. From the corner of my eye, I saw Dr. Chen lean forward, her attention completely focused on our work. When we finally closed and stepped back, the patient was stable, breathing on his own, with excellent prospects for recovery. Later that evening, Dr. Chen found me in the resident lounge, exhausted after 16 hours of continuous surgery. She sat down without invitation, her expression unreadable. "That modified vascular approach you used today," she began. "Where did you learn that?" I explained that I'd developed it during my research on trauma techniques, combining elements from different surgical traditions to create something more effective for specific injury patterns. She listened without interruption, asking pointed questions that demonstrated her deep understanding of the subject. "I've been practicing trauma surgery for 20 years, she said finally. "I've worked in Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, places where we had to innovate or watch people die. What you did today, that kind of adaptive thinking under pressure, that's not something you can teach in medical school." She paused, studying my face. "I'm putting together a team for a medical mission to Guatemala. Rural areas, limited resources, complex trauma cases that would challenge the best surgeons in the world. I want you on that team." The offer left me speechless. Dr. Chen's medical missions were legendary, opportunities that established surgeons competed for years to join. She was offering it to a second-year resident with scarred hands and a family that still questioned her capabilities. "There's one condition," she continued. "This isn't charity. I'm not taking you because I feel sorry for you, or because I want to give you a chance despite your appearance. I'm taking you because you're one of the most naturally gifted trauma surgeons I've ever observed. Your scars tell me you understand trauma from the patient's perspective, and that understanding makes you better at treating it." I accepted immediately, knowing that this opportunity would either validate everything I'd worked for or expose me as a fraud on an international stage. But I also knew I couldn't pass up the chance to work alongside one of the most respected surgeons in the field. My family's reaction was predictably catastrophic. When I called to tell them about the Guatemala mission, the silence stretched so long I thought the connection had been lost. Finally, my mother's voice came through, thin and strained. "Elena, honey, that sounds incredibly dangerous. You're still recovering, still adjusting. Maybe you should wait a few more years, gain more experience in safer environments." My father was more direct. "This is reckless. You're putting yourself and others at risk because you're trying to prove something that doesn't need proving. We know you're capable, but there's capable and there's reasonable." The conversation deteriorated from there. Carmen accused me of being selfish, of pursuing dangerous opportunities to spite the family. "You're not just risking your own life," she said, her voice rising to near shouting. "You're risking the lives of patients who deserve surgeons without limitations, without emotional baggage, without scars that might make them hesitate at critical moments." Her words hit like physical blows, each accusation landing exactly where she knew it would hurt most. The implication that my trauma made me dangerous to patients, that my scars were a liability rather than evidence of survival, that my determination was actually selfishness disguised as professional ambition. I hung up the phone and didn't speak to any of them for 3 weeks. Instead, I focused on preparing for Guatemala, studying tropical medicine, reviewing techniques for surgery in resource-limited environments, and working longer shifts to gain as much experience as possible before departure. The night before I was scheduled to leave, I received an unexpected visit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Carmen showed up at my apartment, her eyes red from crying, carrying a manila envelope that she clutched like a lifeline. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside the envelope were newspaper clippings, printouts from medical journals, and photographs. All of them featured me. The local paper had run a story about the Guatemala mission, highlighting the young resident from their community who was joining an internationally renowned surgical team. The medical journals had published my research on innovative trauma techniques. The photographs showed me in my surgical scrubs, confident and professional, my scars visible but not defining. "I didn't know," Carmen said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know you were publishing research, that other doctors were requesting you for their surgeries, that people were writing articles about your work." She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of shame and admiration. "I've been so focused on protecting you that I never saw how strong you'd become." The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, years of misunderstanding and misplaced concern finally finding words. Carmen admitted that she'd been terrified of losing me again, that watching me pursue high-risk surgery felt like watching me walk back into that burning car. My parents, she explained, weren't trying to hold me back out of cruelty, but out of fear that they'd already lost one daughter and couldn't bear to lose another. But understanding their motivation didn't erase the damage their doubt had caused. As I boarded the plane to Guatemala the next morning, I carried their newfound support, but I also carried the memory of years when that support had been withheld, when I'd had to fight not just my injuries, but my family's limitations on my dreams. 3 days into the mission, everything I thought I knew about surgery was tested. We were working in a makeshift hospital, treating victims of a bus accident that had occurred on a mountain road. The injuries were severe, the resources were limited, and the patients kept coming. Dr. Chen assigned me to lead a surgery on a teenage girl whose internal injuries were so complex that in a normal hospital, we would have assembled a team of specialists. Here, it was just me, a local anesthesiologist, and 2 nurses who spoke limited English. As I made the first incision, my hands steadied despite the primitive conditions. I realized that everything my family had feared about my limitations was about to be put to the ultimate test. The girl's life depended on whether their doubts or Dr. Chen's confidence had been correct. The teenage girl's name was Isabella, and she was dying on my operating table in a converted classroom 50 miles from the nearest major hospital. Her spleen was ruptured, her left kidney was barely functioning, and there was internal bleeding that I couldn't locate with the basic imaging equipment we had available. In a fully equipped trauma center, this would be challenging. Here, with flickering overhead lights and instruments that had been sterilized in boiling water, it felt impossible. Dr. Chen stood behind me, not interfering, but ready to step in if I faltered. "Talk me through what you're seeing," she said quietly, her voice steady in the controlled chaos of our makeshift operating room. I described the damage as I explored Isabella's abdomen, my scarred fingers moving with a confidence that surprised even me. The tissue planes were distorted by trauma. Bleeding was obscuring my view, and every decision carried life or death consequences. But something remarkable was happening. My hands, these same hands that my family had pitied, that medical school advisors had questioned, were performing with a precision and intuition that felt almost supernatural. I found the source of the bleeding, a torn mesenteric artery that was pumping Isabella's life away with each heartbeat. The repair required a technique I'd only read about in journals, a microsurgical approach that demanded absolute steadiness and perfect visualization. As I worked, the room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and my own quiet explanations of each step. 3 hours later, Isabella's vitals were stable. Her bleeding had stopped, her kidney function was improving, and her young body was already beginning the process of healing. As I closed the final layer of her incision, Dr. Chen placed a hand on my shoulder. "That was extraordinary work," she said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I've seen senior attendings struggle with less complex cases in fully equipped hospitals." The mission continued for 2 more weeks, and with each surgery, each crisis, each impossible case, my confidence grew. But more importantly, my reputation was growing beyond the walls of our temporary hospital. Dr. Chen was documenting our cases, photographing techniques, recording outcomes. She was building a portfolio of evidence that would change how the medical world saw trauma surgery in resource-limited settings. On our final day in Guatemala, she pulled me aside for a conversation that would reshape my entire career trajectory. "Elena," she said, using my first name for the first time since we'd met, "I'm writing a paper on innovative trauma techniques observed during this mission. Your work is going to be featured prominently, with full attribution and analysis of outcomes." She handed me a draft of the paper, and I saw my name listed as co-author on what would become a landmark study in trauma surgery. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. "I'm also recommending you for the Davidson Fellowship," she continued. "It's the most prestigious award in trauma surgery, given annually to one surgeon who has demonstrated exceptional innovation and skill. You'd be the youngest recipient in the fellowship's history." The Davidson Fellowship wasn't just an award, it was a career-defining recognition that opened doors to the most elite positions in medicine. Recipients went on to lead departments at major hospitals, pioneer new techniques, and shape the future of surgical practice. The idea that I, a second-year resident with visible scars and a family that had questioned my capabilities, could be considered for such recognition seemed impossible. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said, her expression growing more serious. "I've been offered the position of Chief of Trauma Surgery at Denver General Hospital. It's a new program, building a trauma center from the ground up, with unlimited resources and the mandate to innovate. I want you to come with me as my associate director when you complete your residency." Denver General was being built to be the premier trauma center in the Mountain West, a destination for the most complex cases and the most talented surgeons. The associate director position would make me one of the youngest department leaders in the country, responsible for developing protocols, training residents, and handling the most challenging cases that came through the doors. I accepted both opportunities immediately, knowing that they represented validation beyond anything I had dared to imagine. But I also knew that the real test would come when I returned home and faced my family with news of recognition they had never thought possible. The flight back to Phoenix gave me time to process everything that had happened. I looked at my reflection in the airplane window, seeing the scars that would always mark my skin but no longer defined my capabilities. Somewhere over Mexico, I made a decision that had been building for months. I was going to invite my entire family to the Davidson Fellowship ceremony. Not to prove anything to them, but to share a moment of triumph that had grown from the very trauma they had seen as my limitation. This ceremony was held at the American College of Surgeons annual conference in Chicago, with over 1,000 of the world's most respected surgeons in attendance. As I walked onto the stage to accept the fellowship, I spotted my family in the audience. My parents were there, dressed in their finest clothes, looking simultaneously proud and bewildered. Carmen sat beside them, tears streaming down her face, holding a program that featured my photograph and biography. Dr. Morrison, the trauma chief who had first given me a chance at St. Mary's, introduced me to the audience. His words carried across the massive auditorium. Dr. Elena Martinez represents the future of trauma surgery. Her innovative techniques, developed through a deep understanding of both the medical and human aspects of trauma, have already saved countless lives and will continue to advance our field for decades to come. As I accepted the award, I looked out at an audience of surgeons who had once been skeptical of my abilities. Now they were applauding not just my recognition, but the techniques I had developed, the lives I had saved, and the barriers I had broken. The little girl who had been told she would never be normal again was being celebrated by the most elite practitioners in her field. But the moment that meant the most came after the ceremony, when my family approached me in the reception hall. My father, who had once suggested I pursue administration work, struggled to find words. Finally, he simply said, "I was wrong, Mija. I was so wrong about everything." My mother, who had worried that my scars would limit my opportunities, reached out to touch my hand. "I see now that we were trying to protect you from a world that we thought would reject you. But you didn't need our protection. You needed our support, and I'm sorry it took us so long to understand the difference." The conversation with my family continued long into the night, years of misunderstanding finally giving way to acceptance and genuine pride. They had attended the ceremony expecting to support me, in spite of my limitations. Instead, they discovered that what they had seen as limitations had actually been the source of my greatest strengths. 6 months later, I stood in the brand new trauma bay at Denver General Hospital, wearing scrubs with Dr. E. Martinez, Associate Director, embroidered on the pocket. The hospital was equipped with the most advanced surgical technology available, staffed by hand-picked specialists, and designed to handle the most complex trauma cases in the region. Dr. Chen found me reviewing patient charts on my first official day in the new position. "Any regrets?" she asked, gesturing toward the state-of-the-art facility that surrounded us. I looked around at the surgical suites that would become my second home, at the staff who would depend on my leadership, at the patients whose lives would be in my hands. Then I looked down at my own hands, still marked by scars but now recognized as among the most skilled in the field. "The only regret I have," I said, "is that it took me so long to realize that normal people could never do what we do. Normal people haven't been through fire and emerged stronger. Normal people don't understand trauma from both sides of the scalpel. Normal people can't turn their worst moments into their greatest strengths." That afternoon, I performed my first surgery as associate director, leading a team in a complex procedure that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. As I worked, my hands steady and sure, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every scar told a story not of limitation but of resilience. Every challenge had built strength. Every doubt had sharpened determination. The girl who had been told she would never be normal again had become something better than normal. She had become exceptional, and in doing so, had redefined what was possible for everyone who would follow in her footsteps. 2 years into my role as associate director, the call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would test everything I had learned about trauma, leadership, and the thin line between life and death. A massive industrial explosion at a chemical plant had created casualties unlike anything Denver had seen before. 17 workers were being rushed to our facility, each with complex burns, inhalation injuries, and chemical exposure that made standard treatment protocols useless. I arrived at the hospital to find controlled chaos. Ambulances were lined up outside the emergency bay, paramedics wheeling in victims whose injuries defied easy categorization. The emergency department was overwhelmed, and our trauma team was about to face the kind of multi-casualty event that destroys careers and haunts survivors. Dr. Chen found me in the trauma bay, her face grim with the weight of what we were confronting. "Elena, I need you to take point on triage and coordinate the surgical teams. This is beyond anything we've trained for, but if anyone can manage this, it's you." The confidence in her voice steadied me, but I could see the concern in her eyes. We were about to attempt something that most trauma centers would consider impossible. The first victim wheeled in was a man in his 50s, his body covered with chemical burns that had penetrated deep into muscle tissue. Traditional burn protocols wouldn't work because the chemical composition was still eating away at healthy tissue. As I examined him, my mind raced through every research paper I'd read on chemical injuries, every experimental treatment I'd studied during my fellowship work. I made a decision that would have seemed insane to most trauma surgeons. Instead of following standard debridement procedures, I opted for an innovative neutralization technique combined with immediate skin grafting using synthetic materials that could bond with damaged tissue. It was experimental, unproven, and exactly the kind of risk-taking that my family had once feared would define my career. As I worked on the first patient, directing a team of nurses and residents through procedures that existed more in theory than practice, the second wave of casualties arrived. These victims had been closer to the explosion, their injuries so severe that in most hospitals, they would have been classified as unsalvageable. But something extraordinary was happening in our trauma bays. My years of working with limited resources in Guatemala had taught me to see possibilities where others saw impossibilities. My understanding of trauma from a patient's perspective allowed me to anticipate complications before they became critical. Most importantly, my hands, these scarred hands that had once been seen as a liability, were performing with a precision that seemed to slow time itself. I moved between operating rooms like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony. In Oregon 3, I guided a cardiothoracic team through a repair of blast injuries to the heart and lungs. In Oregon 5, I worked alongside an orthopedic surgeon to reconstruct shattered limbs while maintaining blood flow to dying tissue. In Oregon 7, I performed a procedure I had only read about in medical journals, using microsurgical techniques to repair facial injuries so severe that the patient's identity was unrecognizable. For 14 hours straight, I operated, consulted, directed, and innovated. I lost track of how many lives passed through my hands, how many impossible decisions I made in split seconds, how many times I had to choose between conventional wisdom and desperate innovation. What I didn't lose track of was the growing crowd of observers. Word of what was happening at Denver General had spread throughout the medical community. Surgeons from other hospitals had arrived to assist, but many stayed to watch something unprecedented unfold. Dr. Richard Lawson, the chief of surgery at Presbyterian Hospital, and a man who had once questioned my qualifications during a medical conference, stood in the observation deck above OR 4, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement as he watched me perform a procedure that shouldn't have been possible. The breakthrough moment came during hour 10, when the most critically injured victim was wheeled in. Maria Santos, a 28-year-old engineer who had been at the center of the explosion, arrived with injuries that made every previous case look manageable. Her burns covered 80% of her body, her airways were damaged by chemical inhalation, and her internal organs were failing from toxic exposure. In any other hospital, Maria would have been given comfort care and allowed to die with dignity, but I looked at her unconscious form and saw something that others missed. Her vital signs, while critical, showed patterns that reminded me of my own recovery process years earlier. She was fighting with the same desperation I had once felt, and I recognized in her injuries the same type of trauma that had taught me the difference between surviving and living. I called for our most experimental treatment protocols, techniques that existed only in research papers and theoretical discussions. As I began working on Maria, explaining each step to the team of residents and fellows who had gathered to observe, I realized that I was creating new surgical procedures in real time, guided by intuition that had been forged in my own experience of catastrophic injury. The room fell silent except for the steady rhythm of life support machines and my quiet instructions to the surgical team. Every movement had to be perfect. Every decision carried the weight of a life that hung in the balance. As I worked, reconstructing damaged tissue and restoring function to organs that had been poisoned by chemical exposure, I felt a clarity that I had never experienced before. This was why I had survived my own trauma. This was why I had endured years of doubt and limitation from people who couldn't see beyond my scars. This was why I had pushed through medical school, residency, and fellowship despite every obstacle placed in my path. Every challenge had been preparation for this moment, when 17 lives depended on skills that only trauma could have taught me. 6 hours later, I stepped out of the final operating room to find a crowd waiting in the hallway. Hospital administrators, department chiefs, fellow surgeons, residents, nurses, and reporters had gathered to witness the outcome of what was already being called a miracle of modern trauma surgery. All 17 victims had survived. Not just survived, but were expected to make full recoveries using techniques that would revolutionize how chemical injuries were treated worldwide. Dr. Chen approached me as I stripped off my surgical gloves, her eyes reflecting an emotion I had never seen before. "Elena," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion and admiration, "in 30 years of trauma surgery, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished here today. You didn't just save 17 lives, you rewrote the textbook on mass casualty trauma management." But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Huang, my former medical school advisor, who had once suggested I consider pathology instead of surgery, had flown in from Colorado to observe the procedures. She found me in the break room, where I was finally allowing myself a moment to process what had happened. "Dr. Martinez," she began, her voice formal but trembling with emotion, "I owe you an apology that is years overdue. When I suggested you avoid surgery, I thought I was protecting you from failure and protecting patients from risk. I was wrong on both counts." She paused, gathering herself. "What you did today proved something I should have understood long ago. Your scars weren't a limitation to overcome. They were qualifications that made you uniquely suited for this work." The media attention that followed was overwhelming. Medical journals requested detailed accounts of the procedures I had developed. Surgical conferences invited me to present my techniques. The case study of the Denver General chemical explosion became required reading in trauma surgery programs worldwide. But more importantly, the paradigm had shifted. Trauma survivors were no longer seen as damaged goods struggling to return to normal function. They were recognized as individuals whose experience with catastrophic injury could provide insights unavailable to those who had never faced such challenges. 3 months after the explosion, I stood before the International Society of Trauma Surgeons at their annual conference in Vienna. The auditorium was packed with over 2,000 of the world's most renowned trauma specialists. I was there to deliver the keynote address on innovative approaches to mass casualty management, but I knew that my real message was about the transformation of perceived limitation into exceptional strength. As I looked out at the audience, I spotted familiar faces in the crowd. My parents had flown to Austria for the presentation, sitting in the front row with expressions of pride and wonder. Carmen was there too, along with several cousins and family friends who had made the trip to witness what they now understood was a defining moment in medical history. I began my presentation with a confession that silenced the room. 5 years ago, my own family suggested I was too damaged to be a surgeon. They worried that my trauma would make me dangerous to patients, that my limitations would put lives at risk. They were half right. My trauma did make me dangerous, but not to patients. It made me dangerous to conventional thinking, to acceptance of impossible cases, to the belief that normal approaches are always the best approaches. The applause that followed was thunderous, but I wasn't finished. I wanted them to understand that the lesson extended far beyond my personal journey. Every trauma surgeon in this room has seen patients who survived injuries that should have been fatal. We celebrate their recoveries, but we rarely consider what their survival has taught them about resilience, adaptation, and the redefinition of possible. Today, I want to challenge every one of you to look at trauma survivors not as patients who need to return to normal, but as individuals who have learned skills that normal people simply cannot possess. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but the real validation came afterward, during the reception. Surgeon after surgeon approached me with stories of their own patients who had overcome impossible odds, of techniques they had learned from individuals who had experienced catastrophic injury, of insights that could only come from those who had been forced to redefine their relationship with physical limitation. Dr. James Morrison, who had given me my first opportunity at St. Mary's Hospital, found me near the end of the evening. "Elena," he said, "do you remember what I told you when you first applied to our program?" I nodded, recalling his words about my understanding of trauma from both sides of the operating table. "I was more right than I knew," he continued. "You haven't just become an exceptional surgeon despite your trauma. You've become an exceptional surgeon because of it. And in doing so, you've changed how all of us think about the relationship between survival and strength." As the conference ended, and I prepared to return to Denver, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared, burned girl who had once overheard her parents planning her diminished future had become a leader in her field, not by overcoming her trauma, but by transforming it into her greatest professional asset. The final validation came 6 months later, when I received a call from the World Health Organization. They were establishing a new global initiative for trauma surgery in resource-limited settings, and they wanted me to lead the program. The position would involve training surgeons worldwide in innovative techniques, developing protocols for mass casualty events, and building trauma centers in regions where such facilities had never existed. I accepted immediately, knowing that the work would allow me to share the lessons I had learned not just with individual patients, but with medical systems that could benefit entire populations. As I prepared for this new chapter, I understood that my story had come full circle. The trauma that my family had once seen as my limitation had become the foundation for contributions that would extend far beyond anything a normal career could have achieved. My mother called me the night before I was scheduled to leave for my first WHO assignment in South Sudan. "Misha," she said, her voice filled with a pride that had taken years to develop, "I finally understand what that doctor meant when she said normal people can't do what you do. Normal people haven't been where you've been. Normal people don't carry the wisdom that comes from rebuilding yourself from nothing. Normal people are limited by their fear of trauma, but you've learned to use trauma as a tool for healing others." As I hung up the phone, I looked at my reflection in the window of my Denver apartment. The scars were still there, still visible, still telling the story of a night when everything had changed. But now I understood that they weren't marks of damage. They were evidence of transformation, proof that the worst moments of life could become the foundation for the best contributions a person could make to the world. The woman who had once been told she would never be normal again had discovered something far more valuable than normal. She had discovered that exceptional was possible, and in reaching for it, she had redefined what trauma survivors could achieve. The refugee camp in South Sudan stretched beyond the horizon, a sea of white tents housing over 60,000 people who had fled violence, famine, and despair. I stood at the entrance to what would become the region's first advanced trauma center, watching trucks unload medical equipment that represented hope in its most tangible form. The World Health Organization had given me 18 months to establish a facility that could handle the most complex trauma cases in one of the world's most challenging environments. My team consisted of 12 surgeons from 6 different countries, each handpicked for their ability to work under impossible conditions. But as we began setting up operations, I realized that the real challenge wouldn't be the lack of resources or the primitive conditions. It would be convincing local medical staff that trauma surgery could be performed successfully by someone who looked like me. Dr. Amira Hassan, the chief medical officer for the region, had been skeptical from the moment I arrived. She had trained in London, worked in pristine hospitals, and struggled to understand why the WHO had sent a scarred American woman to lead such a critical mission. During our first meeting, she was professional but distant, her questions focusing more on my credentials than my experience. "Dr. Martinez," she said, reviewing my file with barely concealed doubt, "I see you have extensive experience in trauma surgery, but this environment is unlike anything you've encountered. Our patients have injuries complicated by malnutrition, infectious diseases, and delayed treatment. Are you certain your techniques will be effective here?" I understood her concern. She was responsible for the lives of thousands of people who had already suffered unimaginable trauma. The last thing she needed was an experimental surgeon whose methods might fail when conventional approaches would succeed. But I also knew that conventional approaches had already failed these patients. They needed something different, something that could only come from someone who understood trauma from the deepest possible level. The opportunity to prove myself came sooner than expected. On our third day of operations, a young mother named Fatima was brought to our makeshift emergency room. She had been caught in a bombing that had destroyed her village, suffering injuries that included severe burns, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding that had gone untreated for over a week. Her condition was so deteriorated that even our most optimistic assessments gave her less than a 20% chance of survival. Dr. Hassan took one look at Fatima's injuries and shook her head. "She's too far gone," she said quietly. "We should focus on keeping her comfortable and directing our resources toward patients we can actually save." It was a reasonable medical decision, the kind of triage choice that experienced trauma surgeons made every day in overwhelming situations. But something about Fatima's condition reminded me of my own lowest moments after the accident. The way she fought for each breath, the determination in her eyes despite the pain that racked her body, the refusal to surrender even when surrender would have been merciful. I saw in her the same will to survive that had carried me through months of rehabilitation and years of proving myself in a profession that had initially rejected me. "Give me 6 hours," I told Dr. Hassan. "If I can't stabilize her in 6 hours, we'll transition to comfort care. But I think she's stronger than her injuries suggest, and I want to give her the chance to prove it." Dr. Hassan agreed reluctantly, more out of respect for WHO protocol than confidence in my judgment. As I prepared for surgery in our basic operating room, word spread throughout the camp that the American surgeon was attempting an impossible procedure. Local medical staff gathered to observe, some out of professional curiosity, others waiting to witness what they expected would be an instructive failure. The surgery took 8 hours. 8 hours of working with equipment that barely functioned, in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable in any modern hospital, on a patient whose injuries challenged every technique I had ever learned. But as I worked, something extraordinary happened. My hands moved with absolute certainty, guided by intuition that had been refined through years of facing the impossible. I used techniques I had developed during the Denver chemical explosion, modified them for the resources available, and improvised solutions that existed nowhere in medical literature. When Fatima's blood pressure dropped to critical levels, I performed a procedure that combined elements of vascular surgery, emergency medicine, and pure innovation. When her breathing became labored due to infection, I created an airway management system using equipment that had been designed for completely different purposes. Most importantly, I talked to Fatima throughout the procedure. Even though she was unconscious, I told her about my own journey from devastating injury to unexpected strength. I described the moment when I realized that trauma could become a superpower, rather than a limitation. I shared my understanding that the worst experiences in life often contained the seeds of the greatest achievements. As I worked, I became aware that the observation area above the operating room was filling with people. Not just medical staff, but patients, family members, and community leaders who had heard about what was happening. They watched in complete silence as I performed procedures that seemed to defy medical logic, using tools that shouldn't have been adequate and techniques that shouldn't have been possible. When I finally closed Fatima's last incision, her vital signs were stable for the first time since she had arrived at the camp. Her breathing was steady, her blood pressure was within normal ranges, and her body was already beginning the complex process of healing. The room erupted in applause, but the sound that mattered most was the quiet intake of breath from Dr. Hassan, who had observed the entire procedure with growing amazement. "Dr. Martinez," she said as we left the operating room, "I owe you an apology. I judged your capabilities based on your appearance rather than your skills. What you accomplished in there wasn't just exceptional surgery. It was a masterclass in trauma medicine that I will study for the rest of my career." But the real validation came over the following weeks, as Fatima's recovery progressed and word of her survival spread throughout the refugee community. Patients who had been considered untreatable began asking for the scarred American doctor. Families who had lost hope started bringing their most critically injured members to our facility. Most importantly, local medical staff began requesting training in the techniques they had witnessed. Dr. Hassan became my strongest advocate, documenting every procedure, recording every innovation, and building a comprehensive training program based on what she called trauma-informed surgery. She had recognized that my approach wasn't just about technical skill, but about understanding the psychological and physical experience of catastrophic injury in ways that could only come from personal experience. 3 months into the mission, I received a video call that would change everything. My sister Carmen was calling from Denver, her face streaked with tears, her voice breaking with emotion I had never heard before. "Elena," she said, "I need your help. There's been an accident." The details came in fragments. A house fire in their neighborhood had trapped a family of 4 inside a burning building. Carmen's 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, had run into the flames to help them escape. She had saved 2 children and an elderly man, but in the process had suffered burns that covered 30% of her body. She was in the pediatric intensive care unit at Denver General, the same hospital where I had built my reputation. "The doctors here are good," Carmen said, "but they're telling us that the scarring will be extensive, that she might never regain full function in her hands, that her face will be permanently disfigured. They're already talking about limitations, about adjusting expectations, about helping her cope with a different kind of life." The irony was heartbreaking and illuminating. Carmen was hearing the same predictions about her daughter that our parents had once made about me. I made a decision that would require leaving my WHO mission early, potentially damaging my standing with the organization and disrupting the trauma center we had worked months to establish. But family needed family, and Sophia needed someone who understood that catastrophic injury could be the beginning of extraordinary strength rather than the end of normal possibilities. The flight back to Denver felt like traveling through time. I was returning to the hospital where I had proven myself, but this time as the internationally recognized expert I had become, rather than the struggling resident I had once been. When I walked into the pediatric ICU, the staff recognized me immediately. Nurses who had watched me develop innovative techniques greeted me with respect that had been earned through years of exceptional work. Sophia was unconscious when I first saw her, her small body covered with bandages that couldn't hide the severity of her injuries. But as I examined her medical records and consulted with her treatment team, I saw patterns that reminded me of my own recovery process. The distribution of burns, the type of tissue damage, the body's response to trauma. All of it was familiar territory that I had navigated, both personally and professionally. Carmen and my parents were in the waiting room, their faces reflecting the same fear and uncertainty that had marked my own family's response to my accident years earlier. But this time, the conversation was different. Instead of discussing limitations and adjusted expectations, we talked about recovery timelines, rehabilitation techniques, and the latest advances in burn treatment that could minimize scarring and maximize function. "She's going to be okay," I told them with absolute certainty. "More than okay. Sophia has the same fighting spirit that helped me turn my trauma into strength. The question isn't whether she'll recover. The question is how we help her understand that her scars will be evidence of heroism rather than marks of damage." Over the following weeks, I worked closely with Sophia's medical team to develop a treatment plan that incorporated everything I had learned about trauma surgery, psychological recovery, and the transformation of injury into empowerment. We used the most advanced skin grafting techniques available, combined them with innovative pain management protocols, and created a rehabilitation program that focused on rebuilding strength rather than accepting limitation. But the most important part of Sophia's treatment wasn't medical. It was the conversation we had when she first regained consciousness and saw her bandaged hands. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Tia Elena, am I going to be ugly like you?" The question broke my heart and filled me with purpose in equal measure. I showed her the scars on my own hands, explaining how each mark told a story of survival, resilience, and eventual triumph. I told her about the patients I had saved with these scarred hands, the techniques I had developed, the recognition I had received from the medical community. Most importantly, I helped her understand that beauty and strength could coexist with visible reminders of trauma. Sophia, I said, holding her small hand in mine. People are going to look at your scars and think they know your story. They're going to see damage and limitation. But you and I know better. We know that these marks are proof that you ran into danger to save others. They're evidence that you're braver than most people will ever be. And someday, when you're old enough to understand, you'll realize that they're also the foundation for achievements that normal people simply cannot reach. The recovery process took months, but Sophia's progress exceeded every prediction her doctors had made. Her hands regained full function, her scars faded more than anyone had expected, and her spirit remained unbroken throughout the most challenging phases of rehabilitation. More importantly, she began to see her experience as a source of strength, rather than a burden to bear. Carmen watched her daughter's transformation with amazement that gradually became understanding. "Elena," she said during one of our many conversations about Sophia's recovery, "I finally comprehend what you went through, and more importantly, what we put you through. We thought we were protecting you by encouraging you to accept limitations. We didn't understand that we were actually asking you to surrender the very experiences that would make you exceptional." The conversation that followed was one of the most healing of my life. Carmen apologized for years of doubt, for questioning my capabilities, for treating my trauma as a liability rather than recognizing it as the source of unique insights and abilities. My parents, who had spent years worried about my safety and my future, finally understood that their concerns had been based on fear rather than realistic assessment of my potential. 6 months after Sophia's accident, I returned to finish my WHO mission in South Sudan. But this time, I brought additional expertise that had been refined through helping my own family navigate trauma recovery. The techniques I had developed for pediatric burn treatment became part of our standard protocols, and the psychological support framework I had created for Sophia was adapted for use with refugee children who had survived various forms of catastrophic injury. Dr. Hassan had maintained our trauma center during my absence, and when I returned, she had a surprise waiting. The facility had been designated as a WHO Center of Excellence, the first such recognition given to a medical facility in sub-Saharan Africa. More importantly, our patient outcomes had exceeded projections by margins that defied statistical probability. We weren't just treating trauma successfully, we were redefining what successful treatment looked like. The day before I was scheduled to complete my mission and return permanently to Denver, a ceremony was held in the refugee camp to recognize the impact of our work. Over 300 people gathered in the central meeting area, including patients we had treated, families we had helped, and medical staff we had trained. But the moment that meant the most came when Fatima, the young mother whose life I had saved during my first week, stood to address the crowd. She spoke in Arabic, her words translated by Dr. Hassan, but her meaning was universal. "Dr. Elena came to us carrying scars that told stories of survival," she said. "We thought those scars made her weak, but we learned that they made her strong. She taught us that trauma is not something to hide from or be ashamed of. It is something to transform into wisdom, strength, and the ability to help others who face similar challenges." The applause that followed was thunderous, but the real recognition came in the weeks that followed, as our training programs were implemented throughout the region. Dozens of local surgeons had learned techniques that would allow them to handle complex trauma cases independently. More importantly, they had learned to see trauma survivors as individuals with unique insights, rather than patients with permanent limitations. On my final day in South Sudan, I received a message that would provide the perfect conclusion to my international mission. The International Committee of the Red Cross had reviewed our work and decided to implement our trauma treatment protocols in refugee camps worldwide. The techniques that had grown from my own experience of catastrophic injury would now be used to help trauma survivors in every corner of the globe. The flight back to Denver gave me time to reflect on a journey that had taken me from being a burned, broken young woman whose family questioned her capabilities to becoming a globally recognized expert whose innovations would save lives for generations to come. But the most meaningful transformation hadn't been professional. It had been personal, the gradual understanding that my trauma hadn't been an obstacle to overcome, but a qualification that had prepared me for work that normal people simply couldn't do. Sophia met me at the airport, her scars barely visible, her smile bright with the confidence that comes from understanding that survival is a superpower rather than a burden. She had started a support group for young burn survivors, sharing the lessons I had taught her about transforming trauma into strength. Watching her help other children navigate their recovery process, I realized that the impact of my journey extended far beyond the operating rooms where I had saved individual lives. Carmen and my parents were there too, their pride no longer tinged with worry or surprise. They had finally understood that the daughter they had once feared was too damaged to succeed, had actually been uniquely prepared for achievements that exceeded anything a conventional path could have offered. The trauma they had seen as my limitation had become the foundation for contributions that would outlast any normal career. As we drove through Denver toward the hospital where I would resume my role as associate director, I thought about the young residents who would train under my supervision. Many of them would be trauma survivors themselves, individuals whose experiences with catastrophic injury had given them insights that couldn't be taught in medical school. I would help them understand that their scars were credentials rather than limitations, that their trauma was preparation rather than damage. The final validation came 3 months later, during a medical conference where I was presenting the results of our South Sudan mission. As I concluded my presentation with data showing how trauma-informed surgical techniques had improved patient outcomes by over 40%, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. She was a medical student, her face marked by burn scars that told their own story of survival. "Dr. Martinez," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind her words. "I was told that my scars would prevent me from becoming a surgeon, that patients would be uncomfortable, that I should consider less visible specialties. How do I respond to people who see limitation where I see preparation?" The question took me back to my own medical school days, to the advisors who had suggested pathology instead of surgery, to the family members who had worried about my safety rather than celebrating my determination. But this time, I had an answer that came from years of proving that trauma survivors weren't limited by their experiences, but empowered by them. "You tell them," I said, my voice carrying across the auditorium, "that normal people can't do what we do. Normal people haven't been where we've been, haven't learned what we've learned, haven't developed the strength that comes from rebuilding yourself from nothing. Your scars aren't obstacles to your success as a surgeon. They're evidence that you're already qualified for challenges that would break people who have never faced real adversity." The applause that followed was more than professional recognition. It was acknowledgement from the medical community that trauma survivors brought unique qualifications to healing work, that their experiences with catastrophic injury prepared them for contributions that conventional training simply couldn't provide. As I left the conference that day, I reflected on a journey that had transformed not just my own understanding of trauma but the medical profession's approach to both treating trauma patients and recognizing the potential of trauma survivors. The young woman who had once been told she would never be normal again had discovered something far more valuable than normal. She had learned that exceptional was possible, and in reaching for it, she had created pathways for others to follow. The text message I received from Sophia that evening provided the perfect conclusion to everything I had experienced. "Tia Elena," she wrote, "I told my friends at school about my scars today. I told them I got them by being brave, and that someday they're going to help me be an even better doctor than I could have been without them. Thank you for teaching me that different and damaged aren't the same thing." Reading those words, I understood that my journey had come full circle. The trauma that my family had once seen as my limitation had become not just the source of my own success, but the foundation for helping others transform their worst experiences into their greatest strengths. The girl who had been told she would never be normal again had become a woman who proved that normal people simply can't achieve what trauma survivors can accomplish when they refuse to accept other people's limitations on their potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.